night on First Tuesday.
The armies of the great allies have joined hands together.
40 years on, the first Russian at that historic meeting is now a Red Army general. And in the backwoods of California, the man he met on the banks of the Elbe when Nazi Germany was cut in two. Good evening. You might have thought it should have been a simple and dignified occasion. We would remember those who died in the struggle against Nazism. The survivors would reunite as old comrades in modest celebration. And on VE Day itself, the protagonists of 40 years ago would take the opportunity to rededicate themselves to the cause of peace in Europe. It wasn't to be. And of course, the truth is that it was always bound to be more complicated. The long bitterness between East and West, and in particular the animosity between Washington and Moscow, made it all but inevitable that VE Day would become a divisive political symbol. All in all, so far from being an occasion for reconciliation and hope, the formal proceedings have been blighted by resentment and ill will. But VE Day is for people as well as governments, a fact which is made abundantly clear in our film tonight, a film which is really a detective story that takes us back and forth between two continents, from the hot sun of California to the snows of rural Russia. The trail begins here, 40 years ago, with the first news that Russian and American troops had joined hands in Germany on the banks of the River Elbe. This photo of an American soldier embracing his Soviet comrades was flashed around the world in celebration of the Allied triumph. And it was this photo which intrigued us. What was that moment like for those two men? What's happened to them since? Were they still alive? Where did they live now? What were their thoughts and feelings today? Might they join hands again? We decided to find out, and Yanks Meet Reds is the story of what we discovered.
This was the total victory that millions had fought for. But the dust hadn't long settled in the ruins of Berlin before the world already knew that it would not be the peace it had prayed for. Today, the landmarks of the Cold War do not echo the hopes of the victors so much as the ghostly warnings of the Nazis themselves. It was Hitler who had predicted the conflict between East and West, and Goebbels who, long before Churchill, had forecast the Iron Curtain that would go down over Europe. For a generation, Berlin has been the city where the world has held its breath. There is not much here to remind an old soldier of the high hopes of 40 years ago. That needs a longer journey, through barriers and border guards, to a place and a time when people still thought it could all turn out differently. The River Elbe, deep inside communist Germany. Here in 1945, the great armies of America and Russia confronted each other, face to face, for the first time. Every soldier knew that the long war had come to an end. For some, it left an even more lasting impression. 2 years ago, it was Joe Pawlowski's last wish to be buried by the River Elbe. What happened here on that April day 40 years ago had haunted him all his life. Throughout the Cold War, in Chicago, he tried to tell his indifferent countrymen of the great moment when Russians and Americans met as friends, and when one half of a divided world had once made contact with the other.
Тут говорят американцы, дайте нам ответь.
In late April 1945, the Americans, moving rapidly eastwards through Germany, were trying desperately to discover the whereabouts of their Russian allies. Then, at last, on the 25th of April, an American patrol linked up with the advancing Russians at Torgau on the River Elbe. Waving a flag made from a bedsheet, they had split the Reich in two, and the whole world celebrated.
After long journeys, toils, and victories, across so many deadly battlefields, the armies of the great Allies have joined hands together.
This was the news the world had been waiting for, and the soldiers on the Elbe made sure they made the most of it. Nothing, wrote one British correspondent, could get in the way of our rapture. We were allies, we met and rejoiced. I can think of nothing so exciting, so warm, so human as this encounter in this alien square. Others put the same message a little differently.
Hello, BBC. Hello, BBC. This is Edward Ward speaking from Corps Headquarters of the Russian Red Army. We've just had a very, very big lunch, and we're all here, and everything is beautiful.
The Allies, Churchill had said, possess an historic yesterday and a great tomorrow. But there would be no great tomorrow. The men of the Elbe returned home to take their places in the two armed camps that have split the world. And it is to their homes, 40 years later, that we have followed them. From the towers of the Kremlin, it was once possible to see the Nazi army at the gates of Moscow. They got no further. In 1945, the first socialist country in the world emerged in triumph to take its place in the world. 'The revolution was long ago. Then the Russians had little enough to celebrate. Now they have spaceships, enough to eat, and there are few old enough to remember what a Russian capitalist looked like. But perhaps, even more than the revolution, it is the war that has shaped the Russia of today. It was not our war. For every Briton killed, 40 Russians lost their lives. Every day, Moscow's new brides commemorate a different, more heartless and more savage war than ours. A war that has not gone away. In a country tired of slogans, one message stands out clear. Nothing and no one shall be forgotten. "500 miles from Moscow, a village school outing is nearing its destination. The headmaster, Alexander Silvashko, came from the Ukraine after the war to teach in the remote village of Kolki near Minsk. To teach and to be an officer in the Red Army were his ambitions. The Nazi invasion of Russia determined which opportunity would come first. By 1945, he was only one of many young Russian heroes. But in the West, Silvashko was famous as the first Russian soldier to meet up with the Americans. Throughout their lives, the children have been taught what the fascists did when their panzers burst down these roads. Now they will see for themselves.
Хатынь не одна деревня, а их 186 сожжены с людьми и вместе сгорели дотла на нашей белорусской земле.
In March 1943, the SS arrived in Katyn. They ordered the men, women and children into a barn, doused it with petrol and set it alight.
Это был дом Каменского, который остался один в живых после того, когда сожгли всю деревню. И вот это все, где колоколы, это были дома, вот, которые сожжены немецко-фашистскими захватчиками.
These are not gravestones for people, but villages. One stone to each of the villages which, like Katyn, were wiped out with all their inhabitants. Many thousand more communities were burned to the ground. For Alexander Silvashko, it is a painful lesson to teach. During the war, his village too was destroyed, and his mother killed by the Germans.
Ребята, мы с вами находимся у вечного огня мемориала Хатынь. 2 230 000 погибло в Белоруссии население. Это каждый 4-й человек. Положим. Положите цветы. В День Победы мы не учимся. Мы празднуем свой праздник, свою победу, постольку она нам дорого досталась. Мы все рассказываем детям, вот, как было, как есть и, конечно, что нас ожидает, если разразится опять война.
Across the world, in the suburbs of Los Angeles, the former Lieutenant William Robertson leaves his home on an exclusive estate built on the backlot where MGM once filmed Huckleberry Finn and Tarzan. After the war, Bill Robertson studied medicine and later settled down to life as a successful neurosurgeon in Los Angeles. Today, he enjoys the pleasures of early retirement in the richest country on earth. Few reminders of World War II disturb the California air, though from time to time historians come looking for the shy, quietly spoken young officer of 40 years ago. Bill Robertson, when he arrived in England late in '44. 6 months of fighting later, it was a different man who hit the headlines. In an America hungry for news and heroes, he was the man who had led the first patrol to meet the Russians. After the link-up, Robertson, much in demand, was rushed back to the States for a whirlwind tour. He has never seen the other members of his patrol since then.
Good to see you. After 40 years. After 40 years. Like crying out loud. Oh, yeah. Hey, I got some. You know, they said the other day in 69 magazine, a picture where we went on a canal. Oh, my God. The one on the bridge? Yeah.
Oh, we had a great...
Excuse me. I think it was about yay long. How are you? What are you guys talking about? Crying out loud. How you doing? Oh, great, great.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Bill. How you doing?
Son of a gun, he hasn't changed a hell of a lot either.
The face is the same, the belly
We've agreed about that. Nobody's changed a bit.
No, we
Crying out loud. That's something, huh? 40 long years, right, Bill?
What's this all about, gentlemen? Is this some kind of high school reunion or something?
Just old guys.
Yeah, just a couple of old fellas. Yeah, just a few old fellas.
This is obviously not the Vietnam War.
We're going back to the big war. WW2.
Spanish-American War.
The
last of the Spanish-American War victims.
Yeah.
I gotta tell you,
We're having
Now, you gotta tell me what
I
the
gotta tell
story
you
is.
something that I haven't told anybody else, but I always felt it. We four guys ended World War II.
Oh, you four?
We were responsible in ending World War II.
This is the first patrol that met the Russians in April 25th, 1945.
And you're just getting together now?
First time in 40 years.
First time in 40 years. You ran into those Russians. What could you possibly say? They didn't speak English, did they?
Not right away, but
We learned new words like Tovarish.
Yeah, Tavares.
Please don't shoot.
Yeah.
Things like that, you know.
they were on the east bank of the Elbe.
Yeah.
We were on the west bank of the
You guys
Elbe.
were heading east and they're heading west,
Yeah.
and the Germans are
Exactly
supposed to be in the middle.
Going both directions. The Russians were busy shooting at us for about an hour, intermittently.
Shooting at you guys?
Yeah. And we had to, they were not paying any attention to the flag we'd made because it had been tried the day before and they'd gotten hurt. So this guy went back to the prison camp back there, just, half a mile away, and got a Russian prisoner who spoke English. And so we could communicate. And then he called across to his friends across the river. They stopped shooting, and we took off. Went across the bridge.
Yeah.
Well, once they recognized us, we were all buddies. I'll tell you, we were buddies.
That was
Well, that's just like
really
when we pulled in on the
good
concentration
soldiers, and they were good, good people. Really happy.
When did you find out that the Russians were bad guys?
Well, we never considered them
We
bad.
never considered
The roadblocks were put up within 2 weeks, so that there was no more fraternization between the Russians and the Americans in our section. There'd be a bridge, there'd be a barrier in the middle of the bridge, guards on both sides. So no longer was there that sort of friendship.
The powers to be had already established where the cutoffs would be, and that's where they went up.
Yeah, we pulled to where our assigned lines were, and then the roadblocks went up. And sort of that spirit of free comradeship, no more. Let me show you something.
Yes.
You got it.
It's turning yellow, kid.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's just, there we are.
The old
Hey, you
Stars
get-
and Stripes.
Yes, Stars and Stripes.
You guys
Daily News,
aged,
what is
you
it?
guys aged a lot better than these newspapers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Incredible.
Yeah.
We felt that we'd beaten the enemy, that with the tremendous effort on the part of both armies, we'd won. I think that the Russian troops felt the same way. I mean, everybody was just overjoyed. The Russian lieutenant that went back with us, Savashko, I do know that he came through the war. I know he's alive, but we've never been able to see each other to sort of reestablish that sense of friendship that was present so many years ago. So I look forward to seeing Alexander Savashko very much indeed.
It's good. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you.
10 лет прошло.
You're well.
10 лет прошло, да.
Good to see you.
Ну, и как самочувствие?
How is your wife?
Очень приятно.
Как чувствует себя ваша жена? плохо, но она здесь.
Oh, she's here?
Да,
Ah,
здесь.
good, good,
Вчера
good,
была, да.
good.
А что с вашей случилось?
What happened to your wife?
She died 4 years ago.
Она умерла 4 года назад, у нее был рак.
Ай-яй-яй. А я ж знал ее. Я знал.
In Russia, the story of the two soldiers who met on a battlefield and shook hands still has a powerful hold on the imagination. A generation which saw their homes and villages destroyed and yet survived to see their post-war reconstruction would not receive a visiting hero from America without presenting its best face.
Mr. Robinson. Mr. Robinson. Mr. Robinson. Так, смеялся потом. На русском.
In Russia, heroes have a public duty. Old soldiers' tales are a private thing, but history belongs to everyone. The children have been sent home to put on their best clothes. The cameras of Soviet TV have been summoned.
Дорогие наши гости, добро пожаловать в нашу школу. Подарите, пожалуйста, попробуйте.
В нашем крае взяють справи полявих працівників, комбайнерів, трактористів, наших маток і батьків. От наших дубров белорусских, полев, мы щиро и лаской вітаем сябров. Коли ласка, дорогие гости, сердечно запрошаем.
This is taken at the time, and this is me, and this is your Russian soldier friend there, and I think this is one of the men on my patrol, Huff, was here, and we were coming over there. Your Russian friend came over here, and then we met on the bank over in here. There must have been 200 of us, the 4 of us and 200 of you, right in this area here, where we celebrated. One of your soldiers gave me this hat ornament. Do you remember that?
Да.
Вы помните, что
вот
один из ваших солдатов дал ему подарок?
Да, почему не помню, помню. Вот. Он с пилотки снял и, пожалуйста, дал вам этот пилотки.
And this is a Russian ring.
Это русское кольцо.
Русский?
Gave it to me at that time.
Один из них подарил ему это кольцо.
Очень приятно, хорошо.
This was our division patch, and I want you to have this. This one on the shoulder here.
Это вот эмблема его дивизии, которая носится на вот на том месте, который он показал.
And these are some of my insignia from the old uniform. This is the infantry.
Это вот пехота.
And here's one of my lieutenant bars, and that's for you.
Это все вам.
Все, спасибо, спасибо. Вот. Все то, что было на Эльбе, у меня все еще так свежо в памяти. Я все помню. Помню и младшего лейтенанта Робертсона. Я его хорошо помню. Помню, какой он был небритый, замученный. Вот. Для меня и тогда боевые товарищи, и сейчас мы остались как боевые друзья. Вот. И с Робертсоном, вот, да и с другими американцами, которые встречались на Эльбе с нашими солдатами и офицерами. Я не вижу преград, которые бы мешали нашей дружбе и сейчас. Я не вижу. Но есть еще силы в мире, которые как бы не способствуют нашей дружбе. мешают. И вот идет какое-то недопонимание вот, со стороны именно правящих кругов Соединенных Штатов Америки. Вот.
After 40 years, peace and harmony break out in a remote Belarusian village. Once again, the doctor from California and the schoolmaster from the Ukraine link arms like old comrades. But there are others who took part in that celebration by the Elbe, fighting men who did not leave the army, but stayed on to man the barricades of East-West conflict. In part 2, we return to Germany with two men who have spent their lives at the front line of the Cold War. A Russian and an American who shook hands on the Elbe in 1945, but have been professional enemies ever since. E-Day. After 6 years of blackout and war, it was time for London to let its hair down. It was time, too, to cheer the hero of the hour. But would they have cheered so loudly if they could have read his thoughts? Apprehension, said Churchill later, filled my mind as I moved about the cheering crowds of Londoners. The Soviet menace to my eyes had already replaced the Nazi foe. In America, too, politicians were already speaking of ideological warfare as vigorous and dangerous as fascism or Nazism. Moscow witnessed sights unprecedented since the revolution, celebrations on a far vaster scale than any other capital. But the rejoicings hid Stalin's deep and growing suspicions which had poisoned relations between East and West in the last months of the war. On the Elbe, the great armies began to melt away. Cameramen continued to take photographs for the record, but each side was already preparing different versions of what the record would say. At exactly the same time, a disturbed Churchill was telegramming Stalin about the growing conflict between East and West. It is quite obvious, he said, that such a quarrel would tear the world to pieces. But on the Elbe, these were voices from afar. No one knew then how soon the party would be over. In Moscow 40 years later, it's unlikely that these elite young guardsmen will ever find themselves dancing with the Americans. Unlikely, too, that anyone would suspect the Major General walking through Red Square capable of such a thing. His name is Alexander Vasilovich Olshansky, a soldier and a party member. For over 40 years, he's served his country all over the Soviet Union. He was a 19-year-old corporal when he met up with the Americans on the River Elbe. This was once the end of an all-American rainbow, the hills and boom towns of Northern California, which went crazy in the rush for gold. Buck Kotzebue is a retired lieutenant colonel who has fought communists from Korea to Vietnam. It's now known that he was the first American to meet the Russians. With the world's eyes on Torgau, his earlier meeting at Strela was overlooked. And while Bill Robertson was being flown back to the States as a hero, the young Lieutenant Kotzebue received no recognition at all. Today, Buck Kotzebue lives in a small house in the hills near Sacramento. After a long career in the military, he's back at college, studying to be a lawyer.
Practically every member of my family was in the Army for some reason or other. I don't know why this came about, but yeah, I can't remember any time when I hadn't planned to be in the Army. I'd planned to be a soldier all my life. About the only time I had any doubts about the Army was when the war ended with the nuclear explosion at Hiroshima, and my initial reaction was that this ends war as a possibility, as a viable or possibility for mankind, and they're not going to need armies, so there goes my career. What am I going to do? And that faded as I looked around and saw what was happening, and figured there might still be a need for soldiers.
In Russia, there was never any doubt about the need for soldiers. Since the war, the Red Army has become more than ever a part of Soviet life. For Alexander Olshansky, it has been his whole life. Today, he is professor of the Kuibyshev Academy of Military Engineering in Moscow, an elite college for carefully chosen officers. Experience during the war, with its vast toll of casualties, emphasized the need for huge supplies of men and equipment. Major General Olshansky's experience as a private digging trenches from Stalingrad to the Elbe understandably prejudiced him in favor of machines that could do the job for him. He now looks back at his 43-year career from the top of his profession. Olshansky's war began when the Germans attacked the Ukraine. At 16, he lived a desperate life under Nazi occupation. With the Russian advance in 43, Olshansky, now in the Red Army, won a growing tally of decorations for bravery. By the end, the survivors knew they were lucky to be alive. Olshansky himself had been wounded 3 times. Now he wanted to go home and become a teacher. But the Red Army was only partly demobilized in 1945. Corporal Olshansky, like many others, was not allowed to leave at the end of the war, and eventually he had to settle for a soldier's life.
Хотел, все мы хотели. Все, когда закончилась война, все хотели идти только домой и только домой. Но, к сожалению, много погибло молодых людей, осталось мало, и кому-то нужно было служить, и, естественно, главное, что не было войны. Главное, что мы поняли, что мы живы, и теперь все зависит от нас. И, конечно, то, что мы сумеем увидеть друг друга на 40-летие, вселяет в нас большие-большие надежды. Мы сейчас убедились, что дух Эльбы живет, дух дружбы живет, дух нашего союзнического долга и уверенность в том, что мы можем жить в мире, если это нужно, так как мы жили в дружбе, когда нужно было уничтожить общего врага фашизм.
But was the spirit of the Elbe real, or was it propaganda? On the eve of
VE Day, members of the reception committee of the Soviet veterans of the Elbe came to the Vnukovo airport to welcome the American veterans of the Elbe River link-up. 10 years ago, they met on the Elbe and have remained true to their friendship born in the fires of war.
But in Washington, Vice President Nixon denounced the reunion and accused the Kremlin of perverting the significance of Elbe Day. The American veterans in Moscow were dismissed as innocents abroad, and their leader, Joe Pavlovsky, as a communist stooge. But for Pavlovsky, 10 years after the link-up, the reunion was a gesture of peace. Ignored at home, Pavlovsky made friends elsewhere. In Moscow, he was greeted by Khrushchev. And when Mikoyan dropped into his Chicago flat for tea, the suspicion grew in America that the spirit of the Elbe had been hijacked.
После 40-летия встречи на Эльбе и 40-летия Победы, я считаю, что народы потребуют от правительств ввести и законодательные акты, запрещающие войну, и потребуют от правительств заключить мирные соглашения, какие сейчас ведутся в Женеве. То есть народом заставить свои правительства сделать все, чтобы войны больше не было.
This is what Joe Pavlovsky believed until he died and was buried on the banks of the Elbe itself. His former commanding officer has never been so optimistic.
I think the Russians use everything for their own purposes. I don't think the spirit of the Elbe approach that they would take and appear to be taking is any different from that they've taken with other peace movements that they've used in the past. They've all been vehicles to advance their position, their thought, their propaganda. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't prefer peace to war, but they want to achieve their ends. If it can be done peacefully, they'll do it peacefully, and if it has to be by force of arms, they'll do it by force of arms, by whatever means they can. Anything goes to accomplish their aims. And I don't think the spirit of the Elbe is any different. I just can't believe it. Naturally, being an American, I look at it from the Americans' point of view. Well, if a Russian came to me and said we can be friends and comrades as we were at that time, I can say that's true, and I am. I'm your friend and comrade right now. I'm not angry at you. I'm not angry at any Russian citizen as an individual. And I'm perfectly prepared to be your friend. But I don't think that translates into a friendship that can exist between their system and our system. I don't believe it can be. They're too inimical to each other.
That's great, thank you. How's it going?
The 40th anniversary in Moscow is the last Alexander Olshansky will see as a soldier. The Major General who wanted to leave the army in 45 will soon be retired and back with his family.
А сколько это что у нее одеяло там? Одеяло? Ну хорошо. Саша, ты что такой? Домик? Да? Домик. Где домик? Покажи, где у него. Саша. Ой, посмотрите, кто пришел. Ну-ка, давайте скорее поднимайтесь, поднимайтесь. Смотри, дедушка пришел там. Давай, Сашуль, встречай дедушку. Иди дедушку встречай, иди скорее. Встречай дедушку. Встречай дедушку.
Саша! Ну, давай завершать. Хорошо. Ну вот. Давай положим. Так, так.
Дядя.
А мы
Дядя, да?
читаем.
Ну, дядя, пошли. Какой дядя? Где дядю ты видишь? А, ну пусть.
These days, Olshansky would rather be called professor than general, and he looks forward eagerly to when he'll be able to spend more time with his books and grandchildren.
Или Мишка тебе не нужен? А? Давай, или эту ты будешь смотреть? Вот эту, ну давай эту. Видишь ли, по меньшей мере эта книжка солиднее. Петух. Это петух, точно, точно. Ну да, ты тоже не догадываешься, это придворные.
Veterans too have their stories, and in Russia the story of the Elbe has been something to celebrate. Its message of peace unalloyed with doubts of Cold War and propaganda. Alexei Baranov was Olshansky's sergeant at the time of the link-up.
Как в 45-м году, так сюда и пошла. Должен быть Коцебу. Нет, ну эти уже, так сказать, люди, которые... Да.
A meeting of old soldiers covering old ground. But this time, Olshansky can tell his comrade that he will soon be going back to the Elbe, and back to meet another soldier whose career has been so different from his own.
Чтобы пройти сюда вот Штрелину, залезть с высоты, чтобы было наблюдение на горностях.
For Bak Kotzebue, the decision to go back was harder. But finally, he too was beckoned to return to the roads across no man's land towards the little town of Strela and the meeting with the Russians.
First time that I saw these roads was in 1945, and 25th of April. Our mission was to move out and contact any Russian forces that might be in the area. This was different. It had a certain element of excitement to it. I'd never had vehicles under my command before. We were infantry and foot sloggers. We moved out with no difficulty. There were a tremendous number of refugees moving back. They were terrified. One farmhouse, we entered and found a family sitting around a table, all dead, all taken poison, scared to death that they were going to be seized by the Russians. I don't think the Germans considered us enemy the way they considered the Russians enemy. We had Germans stopping us, and when we disarm them, they'd get indignant. They said we were supposed to be joining together to fight the Russians. And I said, no way, friend. The fighting's over for you. They didn't want to fight us. And they said, my God, you can't be allied with the Russians. This is typical of the villages that we went through that I remember. And as we came into the village, I would see white flags popping out of the windows along the way, but no people. We knew that the Russians were close by. We knew the war was almost over, and we knew darn well that when we made contact, that for all intents and purposes would end the war for us.
It was 11:30 on a sunny April morning when the patrol, 25 miles inside enemy territory, stopped at the Elbe River. With the Russians waving and waiting for them on the other side, Lieutenant Kotzebue, Private Joe Polowski, and 3 or 4 others boarded a small sailing boat and set off. Excitement grew as the patrol neared the other bank. It was not the Elbe they were crossing, one of the GIs said. It was the River Jordan.
It's been a long time. Не изменился, похожий, я бы узнал, лицо, все, улыбка, такой же, ну, седой, немножко седой.
Done fine, you look good.
А вот так, ну...
Oh, it's wonderful to see you.
Да, а тогда были одинаковые.
Oh, no, I'm in good shape, and it's good to see you. Wonderful. Listen, we need to get this young lady here. I'd like to be able to speak to you. And it was a wonderful surprise for me. I didn't realize that he would be here. Until just a short while ago.
А я узнал, как только вы на плоту подержали, лицо увидел, я бы не ошибся. Я боялся, не узнаю. Думаю, узнаю или нет, а лицо не изменилось.
He was afraid that he wouldn't recognize you, but he says your face hasn't changed at all. You're exactly the same.
Well, good. My golly, it's good to see you.
Почему его называли Бак. Там Бак Коцебу, а в книгах пишут Альбер.
Why do they call you Buck when in all the books you're called Albert?
Nickname.
Не знает?
Сокращенное имя, все.
Ах, Бак это сокращенно. Как генерал, да Васильевич. А тогда звали Саша.
His name now is Alexander Vasilyevich because he's a general, but in those days he was called Sasha.
Сашка, Саша. Ну, мы пойдем тогда туда, да? Пойдем.
I understand that there's going to be a ceremony up at Torgau on the 25th.
25-го сюда приедем. Вы будете?
Are you going to be there?
Да, я буду тоже.
I don't know whether I can come or not, but I'm going to try.
Вы знаете, кто будет? Гордеев.
Please, after you.
Пожалуйста.
No, we came up in the jeeps from over there and got to that point, and that's the point when I fired the flare. You know, the flare went up, and then we stood on the other side and yelled, remember? Okay. And we got a boat. Came across on the boat, paddled, came across. And we're going down there as always we're going. And you threw a line out and pulled us in. You remember that? That we came up, and the Putnam Bridge was here, right?
Да. Но это лодка. А понтон шел на тросах.
Oh, I grabbed the line and pulled the boat in.
Да.
Good.
Вот он здесь подошел, потом здесь вышел.
And then your people were standing right here.
Здесь стоял командир полка Гордеев, ты ему докладывал здесь, помнишь?
I remember that, yeah.
Да. Вот здесь было, значит.
And then we went back across the river.
Да.
Got the jeeps.
Да. Джипы пошли там.
Up on the other side and crossed by ferry.
Да.
And went around and went to your headquarters. Yeah, that was great.
Джипы подошли вокруг, подошли оттуда.
Yeah.
For 40 years, Kotzebue wondered what had happened to the Russians he'd met. In nearby Torgau, he got his answer.
Did you stay there? Did you go on to another front, another fight? Because we didn't. We were finished. The war was, we went back up close to Leipzig.
А у нас еще были.
Для них война уже
Для вас
закончена,
война
да?
кончилась. О, у нас нет. У нас не кончилась. Здесь были бои на Эльбе, потом Дрезден. Я 9 мая был еще раз ранен. Уже на подходе к Праге. Третий раз был ранен в ноги. Вот.
And on the 9th of May, as they approached Prague, he was wounded again for the third time.
Are these wound stripes? Are these wound marks?
The yellow stripe means a serious wound, and the red ones are for not so serious wounds. But поэтому ради встречались.
Мы к Эльбе шли, Сталинград и шли Эльба.
They walked from Stalingrad to the Elbe.
Длинный путь. Ну, мы, солдаты, наши отношения не менялись никогда. Мы не могли даже поверить, что такие отношения могут исчезнуть или ухудшиться. Видимо, смерть президента Рузвельта и новый президент Трумен, они могли изменить отношения, свои собственные, но наши отношения, наших народов, отношения солдат, какие сделали общую большую победу над фашизмом, они измениться не могли. И мне кажется, они не менялись по сей день.
The thing that I've always felt is that the things that cause dissension between nations are things that people like he and I as soldiers aren't really aware of. And sometimes I get the feeling that if somehow or other he and I had some input to the people that made the decisions, they wouldn't make the decisions the way they do. Well, good.
И мы периодически будем встречаться, обмениваться впечатлениями.
We'll have to meet every so often and exchange our
Well,
thoughts.
the 50th anniversary is coming up in 10 years.
Как мы выполняем клятву Эльбы, как мы выполняем свои ветеранские обязательства, обеспечить мир на земле, не допустить больше никаких войн.
So that we can carry out our duty as veterans to make sure there's never another war.
Okay, I think we ought to drink on that. You know, I like that vodka that he has there. Maybe we could drink to that.
Давайте выпивайте за это.
Да, пожалуй.
I remember the first time we met, we drank to everything.
Дайте те нам, мы выпьем это.
Okay. This ought to do it.
Выпьем то, что пили на Эльбе.
Now that we're getting to be old men, we don't want to drink out of the flask anymore.
Уже старики из фляжки не нужно, говорит.
Да. Сейчас можно уже спокойно. Сейчас цивилизация, уют, солнце, все, улыбки.
Now the sun's shining, there are smiles all around. Civilization is reaffirmed.
To you.
За здоровье и дружбу.
To health and friendship.
Health and friendship, I'll drink. That gets better with every drink.
Уже лучше, да.
Once, what happened here set the world rejoicing. Now it's like a far-off tale of make-believe. But here at the Elbe, it remains a difficult story to ignore.
Oh, I think there's definitely something that the soldiers have in common, mainly a realization of what war is and the fact that if it were left up to them, there wouldn't be any wars. The spirit of the Elbe, it's the kind of thing that you can't say that it's not good. You might question whether it's not dreaming the impossible dream, but I think you have to dream some impossible dreams, and just possible that they might come to reality.
Дайте нам водки, повторяю, американцы.
Yanks meet Reds, men divided by the Cold War but united by their common humanity, common experience, and a common sense that peace and friendship should one day triumph. Voices of Hope on the 40th anniversary of VE Day 1945. I'll be back with the next edition of First Tuesday in June. See you then. Good night.